All right, in this video, we'll be wrapping up the section by actually getting our Task Manager app deployed to production. And when it's deployed to production and running on Heroku, it'll be connecting to our production database we created in the last lesson. Now, to get started, let's just clean up our workspace a little bit. The only file I'm going to leave open is dev.env. So I'll right-click that. I will click Close Others. And then we're going to go ahead and collapse all of the expanded directories using this little guy right here. Now, we're still going to work in the Task Manager app, though I just wanted to start with a simpler setup without all of those open files cluttering the workspace. Now, the first thing I'd like to take a quick moment to do is to delete some stuff in the Task Manager project that we're not going to commit and push up. That is the playground directory, which contains a couple of examples we worked through earlier in the class. Now, you can leave the playground folder in the root of the node course directory in place. I'm specifically deleting the playground directory in the Task Manager directory. So right here, I'll go ahead and remove that. And from here, we're now going to initialize this project as a Git repository. And if you remember from a few sections ago, we do that using git init from the terminal. Now from here, we see that over on the right-hand side, we're getting a warning from Visual Studio Code. It's complaining that we have too many active changes and that only some of the Git features that VSC supports will work. And this is just because currently we are set up to track node modules. We'll fix that by ignoring it in just a moment. For the moment though, let's take a quick second to run git status. And we can see all of the stuff that would be committed should we add it and run git commit. Right here, we want to ignore node modules like we had done before with the weather application, and we also want to ignore the config directory. The whole purpose of breaking those values out into environment variables was to make sure that they don't get into the wrong hands, so those are not something that we're going to commit and push. If someone else wants to download our project and work on it, they'll have to set up their own config directory with dev.env to define these 4 values. So what does that mean for us? Well, that means in the Task Manager project, we're going to create .gitignore to set up those directories we want to ignore, and the first is node modules. Now, after node modules, we're also going to ignore config. Then we can save the gitignore file, and we can see that in the sidebar, both of those are now grayed out. So the only things we'll be actually adding to the repository are these 3 files right here, and whatever is inside of the source directory. Down below in the terminal, let's go ahead and actually create our very first commit. Once again, I'll run git status just to take a look and make sure everything is working. And right here, I no longer see node modules or config, which is good. Then we'll run git add dot to go ahead and add everything in the untracked files area to the staging area. And finally, we'll use git commit to create the commit. So that would be git commit with the M flag to provide our message right here inside of quotes. And for an initial commit, I usually use init commit as my message. Now let's go ahead and actually commit all of those changes. And with that in place, we're ready to take this project and actually push it up to services like GitHub and Heroku. We're going to start by setting things up on GitHub, then we'll switch over to Heroku. First up, we have to create a new repository for our project on GitHub, so I'm going to navigate over to the browser, and like we did a few sections ago, we'll go over to github.com. Now, since the last time I worked with GitHub in creating a repository in this class, private repositories have been added to that free plan, which means you can convert your other GitHub projects over to private even if you're not paying GitHub anything, and this new one you create could be created as a private repository as well. So I'll use that plus sign with new repository to create it. Let's go ahead and pick a name. I'll use Task Manager API. We can leave the description empty, and down below, I'll switch this over to private, and I will create the new repository. Now, as we saw a few sections ago, there are 3 ways we can get started, and we want this one, push an existing repository from the command line, we just need to run these two commands. Now, we already explored what exactly these do, so we can just go ahead and copy and paste them this time around. I'll take the first command and bring it over here. I will paste it into the terminal and run it. That sets up the correct remote, letting Git know where it should push the code. Then the second command is the command that actually pushes the code to the server for the very first time. I'll paste that in and run that as well. Now, once that's done, we should be able to head back over to GitHub. We should be able to refresh the page, and we see our actual code showing up, which is great. Right here, we do have this as a private repository, and I can see my source directory with my other configuration files. So now that we have things in place with GitHub, we want to switch our attention over to Heroku. Now, in general, the process is going to be pretty similar to what we did the last time we deployed to Heroku. The only additional consideration is that our application code now relies on these environment variables actually existing, and currently they're not going to exist on the Heroku app. For us, there's some commands we can run from the terminal to set those up. So let's get started by creating the Heroku application. Down below from the terminal, I'll use clear to clear the terminal output. Then after that, we'll go ahead and use Heroku create to create our new app. Now, as you remember, you can provide a name right here for your application. Otherwise, Heroku will just pick a random one for you. I'm going to use Mead-Task Manager. And remember, this name needs to be unique across all Heroku applications, not just those in your account. So typically, I'll prefix my app name with either my last name if it's a personal project or the company name if it's for a client. Now, right here, we can see that everything has been created successfully. We have the URL that we'll be able to visit in the browser to view the application, and we have the repository remote, which has already been set up for us. We now have the origin remote to push our code to GitHub, and we have the Heroku remote to push our code up to Heroku. Now, before we push to Heroku, we do want to set up those environment variables, and we're going to do that from right here in the terminal using a command known as Heroku config. So we can use the config command to set environment variables, read our existing environment variables, and delete values. So right here, to set them, we use Heroku config : set followed by those key value pairs. So key equals value, just like we have up above. Now, if we actually run this command, it is going to set up the environment variable called key with the value, and you can always see exactly what environment variables you have configured by just running Heroku config with no other characters afterwards. Right here, I can see that for my application, I just have one configured variable, key, with the value. Now let's go ahead and remove this example one and set up the three real ones we actually need. Right here, to remove an environment variable, we use Heroku config again. This time though, instead of :set, it is :unset, followed by the name of the environment variable. Here, it's key. So if I run that, it is going to remove it. And if I rerun Heroku config to view the entire list, we're going to see there are none. Now let's go ahead and use Heroku config set once again to set up the real ones we actually need. So right here, Heroku config : set. We're going to start with JWT_secret, and this name needs to match up perfectly with the name up above. Otherwise, the code's not going to be able to find it when your app runs on Heroku. Right here, we're going to set that equal to whatever value we'd like. We can go ahead and just pick a random series of characters or use a password generator. And next up, we're going to go ahead and set up the sendGrid API key. So right here, we can actually copy that from up above if we wanted to. So I'm going to take this entire line, copy it to the clipboard, and paste it down below. So after a space, we can set up another key value pair we want to configure. I'll go ahead and paste the sendGrid1 in. I'm going to fire that off, and that's going to set those two environment variables, And we can see them right here, and everything is looking good so far. The last one we need to set is MongoDB URL, and for that one, once again, we need the connection string that MongoDB Atlas provided us. That means we need our connection string once again. We're going to head back over to the browser, go back over to Atlas, and we're going to navigate away from the users page and back to Overview. So we're switching from Security to Overview, and we'll just click Connect once again. Now here we have those three options. This time we're trying to connect to our database from our application, and we will use the short SRV connection string, and down below we can copy that to the clipboard. Now once again, the user password is not embedded in this string. We're going to have to manually provide that. So for the moment, let's go ahead and actually add this up here in dev.env, just so we can edit the string. It's not going to live here. Then we'll use it in another Heroku config set command down below. So right here, everything between the colon and the @ sign, that is where the password needs to go. So I'll remove the placeholder and I'll type my actual password, my dbpass07, followed by 2 exclamation marks. Now this has since been changed, so if you try to connect using these credentials, it is not going to work as expected, but this is indeed my connection string, so I'm going to highlight the entire thing, copy it to the clipboard, and then delete it from dev.env. So now that I have the finalized connection string, we're going to use Heroku config:set once again. We're setting up Mongo DB_URL typed exactly like we had it above, and we're setting that equal to the following. Now, if you have special characters inside of your URL, you're going to have to wrap it in quotes. If you're on Mac or Linux, you're likely going to want to use single quotes. If you're on Windows, you're going to want to use double quotes. So right here, I'll open up a single quote. I will paste in the URL and add the closing single quote on the end. Now, if we take a look at the URL structure, we'll notice that we have /test right after mongodb.net. That means we're going to be working with a database called test, and that is not what we had used before. If we want to pick a different name for the database, I can just remove test, setting up something like what we were using locally. So over inside of the localhost database, we had, what did we have? It's right up here, Task Manager API. So I'll use the same thing right here. Task-manager-API. Then we have a little query string which was added on, setting something called retry writes to true. That's just going to make sure that if a write does fail, it's attempted again until it works, and that's exactly what we want. Now we can actually go ahead and run this command to set the environment variable, and we're going to use clear to clear the terminal output. And I'll use Heroku config one more time, just to make sure all three environment variables are showing up, and they are, which is fantastic. Now up above, you'll notice that we have port defined, but we have not defined port down below. And once again, that is because port is maintained and managed by Heroku itself. It's not a custom environment variable that we would need to set. Now that we have this in place, the only thing left to do is to push our code up to the server. To do that, we'll use git push. Whoops, I'm currently typing up here. Let's go ahead and not edit that file from the terminal, git push Heroku master. Now the Heroku remote was set up for us when we ran Heroku create. So this is going to get all of our code on the Heroku servers. Then Heroku is going to install all of those dependencies and get our app up and running. Now the first time this runs, it'll take a little while just because it's the first time we're deploying the app. So it actually has to go ahead and grab all of the NPM modules. Later on, it'll be able to use ones in the cache. And right here, I can see that the process is almost complete. In total, it should take maybe 30 seconds to go through. Now, if you do get any errors along the way, and you open up a question in the course Q&A, be sure to include as much information as possible, copying and pasting the output from the terminal. Right here, it looked like everything went well, and we can see the URL where we can access our application. What I'm going to do is take that entire URL, and I am going to copy it to the clipboard. We're then going to head over to Postman and try to interact with the production version of our Task Manager API. Let's go ahead and move over to the Postman application. Now, if you remember, when we first set up Postman, we did create environments. I have Task Manager API in both dev and prod. Now for dev, we set up the URL, but for production, we never had an actual value to provide, but now that's changed. So over here, we'll click Manage Environments. We'll go over to the production environment and we'll set the current value for that URL variable we created much earlier in the class. So we have initial value and current value. Initial value is used when you're collaborating with teammates, which is not something we're doing with Postman. So we can just paste the URL right in current value. And the only thing we want to do is remove that trailing forward slash. We want to end with herokuapp.com. Now if we click Update and we close down the Manage Environments modal, we can switch over to the production environment by clicking the dropdown and selecting it. Now from here, we're actually running requests against our production instance, and if I fire off a read profile request, what do I get? I get please authenticate. Now, it should have failed. I haven't created a single user in the production database, so this is a good sign. It lets us know that our application is up and running and responding correctly. Now let's go ahead and actually create a user in the production environment. So I'm going to go over to Create User. From here, I'll create Andrew3 in the production setup. I fire that off, and down below, I get a 201, and I have my user and their token showing up. Now let's go ahead and fire off Read Profile once again. I should be logged in to the production server, and right here, I can get my data back, which is fantastic. Now that we're able to read and write using our production API and the production database, let's use MongoDB Compass to view the data in the database and make sure everything works there as well. So I'll navigate over to MongoDB Compass, and remember, we have our local host favorite and our production favorite. We want to take a quick moment to connect to the production database. Down below, I'm going to connect, and we should be able to view our single our single database. Right here, we have our databases, and we now have Task Manager API showing up. We can see we have our collection, so let's go ahead and click on the database to check out our users. We have just a single document, and if I crack that open, it is the exact data that we had just set up over inside of Postman. Now from here, we could go ahead and do other things, such as creating tasks. So back in Postman, I'll go over to Create Task, and I'll go ahead and fire that off. Now in body, I have description fourth and completed false. I'll go ahead and switch that up to something else, something like store in production database. I'll send that off, and we'll make sure that it actually shows up in the production database. So once again, navigating back over to the GUI, and from here we can head back to our database and we can see our collections. Now it's not showing up by default, but if I do use Command R, it will refresh the data. We can now see our tasks showing up, and I can click over there to view the brand new task that we just created. So there we go. We have a production database set up, and we have our production application on Heroku with all of the environment variables configured, allowing it to do things like generate those JWT secrets, manage the production database, and send emails when users create accounts or delete their accounts. So now that we have this in place, we have a production version of our Task Manager API up and running, and that's where we're going to stop for this section. In this section, we started by focusing on email sending with Postmark, and we wrapped up with a production deployment. Now, we're not quite done yet. There is still one more section for the Task Manager app. In the next section, we're going to focus on how we can set up automated testing for our Node.js code. So we'll learn how to write test cases for our code to test all sorts of things. I'm really excited to get to that topic because it is an important one. So let's jump right into the section introduction for that.